Hi, it's John Glynn. In this particular session we're going to be looking at macro photography, and the idea is that you'll go off and take some pictures. Flowers are a good thing to do, but it could be insects, it could be something in your house, it could be fruit, anything that you feel is enabling you to do close-ups. Now, macro photography is where you're already close to something but you actually want to get it even closer, so it's a little bit like microscopic type of work rather than the telephoto, which is the other end of the spectrum, where with telephoto photography you've got a telephoto lens, you're a long way away from your subject but you're wanting to bring it closer to you. That would be telephoto. Macro is when you're already close to something and you want to get even closer. Okay, to be able to do macro photography you have to have a lens camera combination that enables you to do that. I have a macro lens. A macro lens on mine is a lens which it's called a prime lens, my particular lens, so it doesn't zoom, but it does allow me to do close-ups. And what I would do if I wanted to get in close to something, I would have to go in really close, and the closer I get, it enables me to do real close-ups. As you can see, I can do a real close-up. It takes me to around about 1:1. 1:1 is where the subject I'm photographing, lettering here, and the subject is actually the same size on the back of the camera, so you could measure it and it'd be 1:1. Your lens has to be able to do 1:1, and this one can. And on my particular lens it's got like a tube that comes out, and on it has got numbers related to the magnification I'm producing. Okay, on a lot of cameras it won't have a tube that comes out, it'll be built in within the actual lens structure, so you don't actually see that necessarily. The other thing is that you'll need to make sure that your lens can do macro photography. Just because you've got a lens doesn't mean it can do close-ups, and it usually will have the word macro on it, or it will have the word close-up. And so if you've got a Canon lens 18 to 55mm zoom, which came with your camera body, then if you're using a single lens reflex camera, the chances are that you've got one which will do close-up. What you would then do with your zoom lens is to set it to 55mm. So on your zoom lens you'll have a number of numbers which will relate to how close you are, or how much you can zoom in by, to your subject. This one has got 17 to 35mm, but you might have one that's 18 to 55. You would put it to 55mm zoom, and then you would walk in closer to your subject, and at some point it will become sharp. Okay, and then your macro or your close-up facility is starting to work. Now, whether it can focus perfectly using the focusing mechanism, or whether you will have to physically move in and out with your body, will depend on the camera system that you actually have. Okay, so it's a matter of a little bit of practice here. With bridge cameras, a bridge camera is a camera which will have a body and lens attached, totally included within its actual mechanism, if you like. You can't detach the lens on a bridge camera. You will have a little, for most bridge cameras, you'll have a little tulip or flower shape symbol somewhere either on the back or on the top of the camera, sometimes within the menu system, and that will enable your lens to do close-up photography. Okay, so you set the lens to that particular symbol, or your camera to that symbol, which will be a tulip usually, and that enables your camera to become, or your lens to become, a close-up lens. So you should be able to get really close. Now with bridge cameras you may get down to something like 2 centimeters away from your subject, so you will be really close to your subject. So the important factor with doing macro photography is really the aperture, where as you zoom in you may find that the aperture you can use will become a limited range, and instead of being 3.5 or 5.6, it may become a smaller range, and you can't go to those sort of size apertures anyway. The assumption is that you're going to go to the other way. You're going to go to apertures of f22, f32, f29. Now this will depend to a larger extent on your lens, because if your lens can't do that aperture, it can't become that aperture. Okay, so an f numbers will be on through your camera body most of the time, but in my lenses I also have them on the actual lens, and it's whether or not you can see them. I've got f numbers here, and the bigger the f number, I've got down to 22 on that one. Let's see if I can show you. f22, the bigger the f number, the smaller the hole in the lens, smaller the aperture, then the sharper, in theory, the sharper your picture will be overall. Okay, I'll do have examples of all this, which I'll show through the video to help hopefully make sense of what I'm saying. So we generally are using very, very small apertures. The bigger the number, the bigger the f number, the smaller the aperture will be. Obviously, the smaller the aperture, the longer it takes light to come in, and therefore you need to change the shutter speed to enable it to do that. So we tend to be using manual mode or aperture value mode. If you try and do an auto, the trouble with auto is it doesn't actually know what you're photographing. The camera hasn't got a clue where it is or what it's doing or why. So it will go to a generic sort of number, and it may not be the right aperture, it may not be the right shutter speed, it may be completely wrong all over the shop anyway. So we want to take control of all the aspects that we can. Therefore, as I said, it'll be aperture value or manual mode that you'll be using for these particular pictures, okay, rather than auto. Okay, so you're going to go off, take some pictures, decide on a subject. Flowers are quite good, they're easy to get, you can just buy them from your local shop. And off we go and start taking pictures. I'm going to show you a little video clip now of my sort of setup, and also some examples of the sort of pictures, and we'll take it from there. Okay. This photograph is one that's been taken using just a standard 50mm lens on my camera, and this is as close as I can get using a standard 50mm lens. Okay, so therefore if I wanted to get closer, that's why we would need to use some other way of doing that, and my preferred way, and the way that I would advise, is through using a dedicated lens which has a macro lens facility built into it. So I'll show you what the macro can do. So this shot here has been taken with a close-up. I've zoomed in. It's not one-to-one as magnification, because the leaves are actually bigger than you see, but it's filled up pretty much the whole frame with my subject, which is what you're trying to do usually, is to fill as much of the frame as possible with your subject. So you can see that it's significantly closer than it would have been or was with the 50mm alone, the lens alone, so it's much closer than 50mm. You'll also notice that it's sharp. It's sharp from the centre and the tips of the petals right the way back to the background almost, not quite down to the floor. I'm looking straight down onto the flower from above. Okay, so I'm looking down onto the floor behind, and you can see that there's other flowers and they're fairly sharp, and there's leaves and they're fairly sharp, the green leaves as well. And this was taken with an aperture of f45 in my particular lens, and an 1/8 of a second as for the time, and at an ISO of 100. Okay, so I had to use a tripod for the simple reason that there's no way I could handhold for an 1/8 of a second. So it gives you an indication as to the shot taken with a small aperture, long exposure, on a tripod, 100 ISO, and that's the kind of picture you might get if you're using a macro lens or close-up lens. So this particular shot is the same as the previous picture, haven't moved the camera at all, but what I have changed is the aperture. So you can see now most distinctly that the background has gone out of focus. The depth of field is therefore much shorter. So I focused on the foreground, the top petals in the middle, but you can see that the back edges have faded away into a softer looking image. And the aperture on this one is f3.8. So the previous one was f45. So this one is f3.8. So it's a big difference in aperture. So I've opened the aperture up and made basically a bigger hole, if you like, for light to come through. And because I've done that, the shutter speed has also changed. So instead of it being an eighth of a second, it is now 1,000th of a second. Okay, for the same or equivalent amount of light. And the ISO is still 100. Okay, so technically, in theory, I could handhold on this particular picture because it's 1,000th of a second. The issue here would be keeping focus, because even though I would focus on a given area handheld, I am still moving ever so slightly. I can't stand stock still as solidly as a tripod can. I'm going to be moving either closer or further away from the plant ever so slightly. I'll be shaking ever so slightly. All of these factors will impact exactly where the focus is going to be by the time I actually take the photograph. So it's still advisable to use a tripod if you want a particular point in the picture to be pin sharp. Okay, and you'd focus on that point, but as you can see, by using a wider aperture, you can control where the eye goes. So in this particular picture, you're more likely to look at the center part, the sharp part of the picture, rather than the blurred edges. Okay, so that's literally changing the aperture has made quite a big difference to the look of the photograph. Okay, so we're here looking at the sort of kit one might need to be doing macro photography. I've got a 50mm macro lens on my camera, and you can see how close I am, and you can see that there are problems. Obviously I'm very close to it, and I've also got a lens hood, and the trouble with the lens hood is that it could cause its own shadow or create its own shadow. So it might be that I can't actually use the lens hood, and it will also restrict me on how close I can actually get anyway, because if my lens wants to get closer than that to the flower, I'd have to take the lens hood off. Other factors you might need would be a tripod, as mine is on a tripod at the moment, and also a cable release of some kind, so that you're not actually touching the camera during the taking of the photograph. Keeping the whole thing steady is really important, and that's because any slight movement from you will have quite a big impact on the sharpness of your actual picture. So once it's set up, you'll want to keep it as steady as possible for the camera. The other issue you've got to think about is the wind that's being out in the natural world. I'm outside, and as I don't have a wind shield, it does mean that if there is any wind, my shutter speed has to be quicker than the wind. To have a shutter speed quicker than the wind that's blowing the plant, and that might impact the aperture I can use and also the ISO I can use, because if I want to get to a particular aperture, I may have to go to a quicker ISO. So these are all factors that come into doing a close-up of something outdoors. So just be aware that outside you'll certainly have to be considering shutter speed because of the movement of the thing you're photographing. If your shutter speed is too slow, you're going to get motion blur. Okay. This photograph you can see here was taken at a 30th of a second. Even though it's on a tripod, there's motion because the actual plant was being blown around by the wind, and the position I'd actually focused on the plant had moved because the plant had actually moved. So these are factors. I'd have to have had a quicker shutter speed to have freeze framed the motion of the plant, but then I couldn't have had the aperture the same, because there wouldn't have been enough light possibly by going to a quicker shutter speed. So I'd have to either up the ISO to compensate, or find another way of taking a picture of the same plant, maybe taking it indoors or taking it on a day when there was less wind. But these are all factors that come into doing macro photography, especially of plants outside. Okay, I've given you an overview of the actual process of doing a macro photography session, if you like, or close-up photography. So I'll just do a very quick going over again the important aspects. The main thing is to remember you need to keep the camera steady. You need to think of the aperture, because you're going to be close up. You're looking at how sharp the subject matter is going to be compared to the background. So changing the aperture is important, or being aware of the aperture. Do be aware that as I had with my camera, which is here somewhere, here we are. Mine is a macro lens, but because it's a 50mm macro, it means I'm very, very close to whatever it is I'm going to be taking pictures of. It becomes a problem. It's better to have a longer lens with macro, so something like 120mm or 200mm, and as I said before, you can even get 300mm macro lenses. That enables you to be further away from your subject and still do close-ups. All you do is you go to the macro mode and you walk in, and as you get closer to your subject, it will then become sharp. So you would actually you'd put it onto its maximum zoom, okay, and then walk towards your subject to do the macro section of it. And some of the cameras will automatically go to macro when you do that, without you having to set a button. But some lenses will have a button on them that says macro. But as I said, the longer the lens, the further you are away from your subject matter, so you're not crushing it, as I am with this particular lens. Okay, just be aware of that. I would therefore set up a tripod or something that's going to keep the camera steady. You don't have to use a cable release. You could put it onto self-timer and put the timer onto something, say, a 2-second timer or the 10-second timer, and that will then take a picture for you without you touching the camera. So if you're a bit nervous about touching the camera because of camera shake, then that's a way of doing it if you don't have a tripod or a cable release of some kind. So that's another option. Have a go. Buy some flowers, go into your garden if you've got a garden, or do something in the house. It doesn't really matter the subject as such, as food is very good as well for this kind of thing, but it could be an insect, so it could be something you're interested in some other way. So just have a go and see how you get on, and we'll take it from there in future sessions. Okay, thanks for watching.